October 17th, 2025. Arizona State Prison Complex, 10:40 a.m. Richard Djerf sits in the execution chamber, calm, collected, the weight of 32 years pressing on him. At 55 years old, he is about to take his last breath. And yet, for decades, he showed no remorse for the horror he unleashed. 4 lives. A father, a mother, an 18-year-old daughter, and a 5-year-old boy. All gone. All because of stolen property. A rifle, some electronics, items anyone could have replaced. Richard didn't just kill, he planned. He waited. He made each family member suffer. He bragged about it afterward, telling his girlfriend, "It was really awesome." But today, as the lethal injection flows, there is silence. No defiance, no bravado, only the end. Behind him, the long shadow of justice and obsession stretches across decades, haunting surviving relatives and the first responders who walked into a scene that would scar them for life. Albert Luna Jr., the man whose theft triggered this nightmare, survived. Everyone else didn't. Today isn't just the end of Richard Djerf's life. It's a grim reminder of how rage, obsession, and betrayal can spiral into unthinkable violence. How a moment of theft can ignite a chain reaction that destroys everything in its path. This is the story of Richard Djerf, a man who let anger and revenge dictate every choice, and the innocent lives that paid the ultimate price. Richard Kenneth Djerf was born on November 6, 1969, in Phoenix, Arizona. From the outside, he seemed ordinary, quiet, reserved, nothing that would suggest the darkness he would later unleash. His childhood wasn't marked by tragedy, at least not the kind that makes headlines. But there was loneliness, a sense of being on the margins. Neighbors would say he was polite but distant. Classmates barely remembered him. He didn't seek attention, didn't make friends easily. He learned to keep to himself, to observe and calculate rather than participate. By his early 20s, Richard had settled into a simple routine. He worked the night shift at a Safeway supermarket, cleaning floors and taking out trash while the world slept. It was solitary work, the kind of job that rewarded patience and quiet efficiency. It was there he met Albert Luna Jr., a co-worker who, for a time, became the only person Richard considered a friend. Together, they navigated the lonely hours of empty aisles and fluorescent lights, talking occasionally, sharing cigarettes or coffee breaks. But even this connection was fragile. Richard kept most of himself hidden. At 23, Richard had his own apartment, a place he meticulously organized, a sanctuary where he controlled everything. He had possessions he valued, an AK-47 rifle, a collection of electronics, a few personal items that marked his life and his space. To anyone else, these were things. To Richard, they were extensions of his order, his control, and his sense of security. When these things were violated, he perceived it as a profound betrayal, a crack in the world he had so carefully built. It wasn't a violent childhood that shaped him, nor a history of abuse or neglect. It was, in many ways, the opposite. A steady, ordinary life, combined with a deep-seated need for control and respect, created the perfect storm. Richard's mind was capable of planning, observing, calculating. He learned to internalize resentment, letting anger fester quietly, growing in the shadows of his everyday routine. The smallest affront could ignite a fire in him that the outside world could never imagine. By the time the theft happened, the burglary that would become the catalyst for the murders, Richard's world was simple but rigid. Any disruption was unacceptable, any challenge to his authority or property intolerable. And when that line was crossed, his quiet, controlled existence unraveled in ways that would leave 4 innocent people dead, an entire family destroyed, and a community shocked for decades. January 1993. Richard Djerf returned to his apartment one evening to find something that would shatter the fragile sense of order he had built around himself. The front door was ajar. At first, he thought it was a mistake, a neighbor, or perhaps he had forgotten to lock it. But stepping inside, the reality hit him immediately. His belongings had been disturbed. Electronics were missing, items he had carefully chosen and safeguarded. Gone. And most importantly, his AK-47 rifle, the weapon he kept locked and maintained, had been stolen. This wasn't a random burglary. Someone knew what they were looking for, knew where it was, knew how to take it without leaving unnecessary traces. And Richard knew exactly who that someone was. Albert Luna Jr., his co-worker, the man he had once considered a friend, had crossed the line. He had been in Richard's apartment before, knew the layout, knew what Richard valued. And now, he had taken it. Richard's first reaction was the logical one. He called the police. He filed a report, described the theft, named Luna Jr., and waited for the law to act. He expected justice to be swift, the stolen property to be returned, the violation to be corrected. But the days stretched into weeks. Weeks turned into months. No one came to his door. No one demanded the return of his rifle. No one held Luna Jr. accountable. The police treated it as just another burglary in a city full of crime. To Richard, it was a betrayal of trust. A personal affront that demanded recognition, a slight that could not go unanswered. At first he tried to move on. He tried to ignore the theft, to bury the anger, to follow the law and wait for justice. But the quiet of his apartment, the nights spent alone cleaning floors at Safeway, and the constant replaying of the betrayal in his mind began to fuel something darker. He couldn't let it go. 9 months passed. 9 months of simmering frustration, of revisiting every detail of the theft, every perceived insult, every imagined slight. The anger didn't fade. It grew, coiled around his thoughts, infiltrating his every plan, his every routine. Soon, the obsession took hold. Richard no longer thought about the stolen items themselves. A rifle could be replaced. Electronics could be bought again. That wasn't the point anymore. It was about control, about respect, about the violation of his space and trust. In his mind, the theft was not just a crime. It was a challenge. A challenge to his authority, his life, his sense of order. And in Richard's eyes, the only way to reclaim that respect, to reassert control, was not through the law, not through patience, but through retaliation. What started as anger had transformed into a relentless plan. A plan that would extend beyond the man who wronged him. A plan that would touch everyone around him. A plan that, by the time it reached its terrifying conclusion, would destroy 4 lives, devastate an entire family, and shock a community for decades to come. September 14th, 1993, Phoenix, Arizona. The Luna family lived an ordinary life in a quiet, working-class neighborhood. Albert Luna Sr. worked long hours to provide for his wife and children. Patricia Luna cared for the home and raised their kids, while 18-year-old Rochelle Luna focused on school and her future, and 5-year-old Damien played quietly around the house, unaware of the horror about to descend. At 4:00 p.m., Richard Djerf arrived at their front door carrying a vase of artificial flowers. From a distance, he looked harmless, almost like a visitor, a neighbor, someone delivering a gift. Patricia noticed him through the window and smiled. That smile disappeared in an instant when Richard drew a 9mm Beretta and forced his way inside. Panic overtook the household. Richard demanded to know where Albert Jr. was. Patricia told him the truth. Her son wasn't home. That should have been enough to end the ordeal. But for Richard, it wasn't about Albert Jr. anymore. It was about revenge, about control, about making the family suffer. He forced Patricia into the garage, loading electronics and valuables into her own car, taking what he felt was owed. Then he brought her and little Damien back into the kitchen. They were bound to chairs with rope and tape, rendered helpless, unable to scream, unable to move. Richard stood in front of them, asking over and over, "Do you want to die first? Or should your little boy?" Psychological terror replaced immediate physical danger, a slow, agonizing torture designed to break their spirits. Rochelle returned home around 2 p.m., expecting a normal afternoon. Instead, she was met with horror. Richard pulled her into her bedroom, gagged her, tied her wrists, and then raped her. Afterward, he stabbed her 3 times in the chest and slit her throat. The sounds of her death carried through the house to the kitchen, where her mother and little brother sat bound, forced to process the violence without the ability to act. Albert C. returned at 4 p.m., unaware of the carnage. He walked into his own home only to be forced to crawl down the hallway, humiliated and terrified. In the bedroom, he was handcuffed face down on the bed and struck repeatedly with a baseball bat. Blood coated the walls, ceiling, and bed, the room resembling a scene of slaughter. Miraculously, Albert Sear regained consciousness despite the trauma. Armed only with a small pocket knife, he attempted to fight back, stabbing Richard in the arm. But the struggle was brief. Richard retrieved his gun and shot Albert Sr. 6 times. Finally, Richard turned back to Patricia and Damien. The same cruel choice was presented. Do you want to watch your child die, or should your child watch you die? Then, without hesitation, he shot them both in the head. 4 lives extinguished in a single day. An entire family obliterated. Richard attempted to destroy the scene, pouring gasoline over the bodies and trying to ignite a fire. The flames never took hold. He left in the Luna family car, returning to his apartment to show his girlfriend the stab wound inflicted by Albert Sr. He spun a story of a mall robbery, playing the victim while 4 innocent people lay dead. September 15th, 1993. The day after the Luna family was slaughtered, Phoenix police officer Ernie Britz arrived at the home. A seasoned detective, 36 years old, with 14 years on the force, Britz had seen shootings, domestic violence, car accidents, drug overdoses. He thought he had seen everything. He was wrong. The kitchen was a tableau of horror. Albert C. lying in a pool of blood, his skull crushed from repeated blows. Patricia and little Damien still bound to chairs, taped and shot in the head, facing each other. Rochelle lay in her bedroom, evidence of sexual assault and violent stabbing surrounding her. Britz would later say it was the worst scene of his career. His partner, John, who went to check the bedrooms, returned visibly shaken, unable to speak about what he had witnessed. Many of the officers who responded refused interviews for years, the trauma too deep. Meanwhile, Richard Djerf, the killer, was already back in his apartment, spinning lies. He told his girlfriend that 2 men had tried to rob him at the mall and that he barely escaped, wounded by a pocket knife. She believed him. While police combed through the Luna home, Richard remained free, proud, and arrogant. Over the next few days, he could not resist bragging. To multiple friends, he described in chilling detail the murders, the torture of Patricia and Damien, and the killing of Rochelle. He told them, "It was really awesome. No remorse, no hesitation. Just pride in what he had done." It was one of these friends who finally acted, horrified by the stories. They went to the police, tipping them off about Richard's confessions. This was the break investigators needed. On September 18th, just 4 days after the murders, officers arrived at Richard's apartment with search warrants. Inside, they found electronics and other items stolen from the Luna household. They discovered the firearms and murder weapons, physical evidence linking Richard to the crime scene, and, most damning, the fresh stab wound inflicted by Albert Sr.'s desperate defense. Every detail tied him unmistakably to the killings. Richard was arrested immediately. He was calm, collected, almost smug. He did not resist. The evidence was overwhelming, leaving no room for doubt. 4 innocent people had been murdered, and the man responsible was sitting quietly in his own apartment, as if nothing had happened. The investigation, which could have been stalled for weeks or months, had moved swiftly thanks to Richard's arrogance and inability to contain his pride. His confessions, repeated to friends and loved ones, ensured that there could be no question about his guilt. By the end of that week, Richard Djerf was officially charged with 4 counts of murder. The police had secured the crime scene, collected evidence, and documented the horror that had unfolded. But beyond the physical evidence, it was the psychological trail he had left. The bragging, the recounting of torture, the meticulous detailing of his crimes, that cemented the case. Richard had not just committed murder. He had announced it repeatedly, without fear or shame. That arrogance, that need to be recognized for his evil, had sealed his fate. August 16th, 1995. Nearly 2 years after the Luna family murders, Richard Djerf stood in the courtroom, facing the weight of his crimes. Unlike most defendants, he did not rely on attorneys to tell his story, argue for his life, or attempt to find mitigating factors. Richard had insisted on representing himself, invoking his rights under what's known as Rule 11 law. The court had to determine if he was competent, if he understood the gravity of self-representation and the consequences that could follow. After careful evaluation, the judges concluded that he was competent. The decision shocked many, but legally, Richard had the right to control his own defense. In court, Richard's strategy was simple: plead guilty, no trial, no testimony from survivors, no experts to argue diminished capacity or mental instability, just an admission of guilt. The prosecution agreed to a plea deal. In exchange for his guilty plea, other charges, including rape, kidnapping, and attempted arson, would be dismissed. Richard thought this might save him. He hoped that by avoiding a trial, the judge might show leniency, perhaps sentence him to life in prison instead of death. But acting Judge Michael Ryan was unflinching. Even with the plea deal, he made it clear the death penalty was the likely outcome. Richard listened, seemingly unfazed. On May 22nd, 1996, the sentence was pronounced. 4 counts of first-degree murder. 4 death sentences, 1 for each member of the Luna family. The judge emphasized Richard's deliberate cruelty, his enjoyment in inflicting suffering, and his callous disregard for human life. Richard's response was telling. He smirked and said, "They can only kill me once." Even at the moment when justice was being delivered, his understanding of the horror he caused seemed limited, detached, almost clinical. Richard's case became a legal landmark for other reasons. By representing himself, he bypassed any chance of a nuanced defense that could have introduced mitigating evidence. Legal scholars now cite his case as an example of self-representation gone wrong. Just because a defendant is competent doesn't mean they should handle their own defense. The choice fast-tracked him to death row. Appeals followed immediately. The Arizona Supreme Court rejected his initial appeal, and the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear his case. In 2002, the Arizona Supreme Court issued a warrant for his execution, only for the U.S. District Court to issue a stay. Legal battles continued, influenced by landmark rulings such as Ring v. Arizona, which determined that only a jury, not a judge, could hand down a death sentence. This decision, along with Schreier v. Summerlin and subsequent appeals, delayed his execution, effectively keeping him alive for decades while the legal system adjusted to new precedents. By 2021, after exhausting every possible appeal, Richard had no legal recourse left. The courts had denied his claims, the death sentence remained intact, and he was one of only 20 inmates in Arizona with completely exhausted appeals. For 25 years, he had lived in limbo, his legal maneuvers prolonging life while the weight of his crimes remained. His choices, self-representation, pleading guilty, rejecting mitigating arguments, cemented his fate, creating a cautionary tale that would be taught in law schools for decades. October 17, 2025. Arizona State Prison Complex. Richard Djerf, 55 years old, sat in the execution chamber, the culmination of 32 years on death row. For decades, he had lived with the consequences of his own actions, navigating a labyrinth of appeals and legal battles. Now, it was time. His final meal was simple, ordinary. A double cheeseburger with lettuce, tomato and ketchup, onion rings, a slice of cherry pie with whipped cream, and a 20-ounce Pepsi with ice. Nothing extravagant, nothing meant to impress. Just comfort food for the last hours of a life defined by cruelty. Officials brought Richard into the chamber. He did not resist. He did not argue. He cooperated, allowing staff to insert the IV for the lethal injection. Vein complications caused delays, multiple attempts, each one a sharp reminder of the human fragility he had so often disregarded. At 10:05 a.m., the IV was successfully placed. Staff asked if he had any last words. After decades of boasting, bragging, and recounting in horrific detail the murders of 4 innocent people, Richard had nothing to say. Silence. No apology, no final defiance, no theatrical flourish. Just the weight of all he had done, finally closing in. At 10:40 a.m., the lethal injection coursed through his veins. Deputy Director John Barcelo confirmed the death. The life of Richard Djerf, the man who had meticulously planned and executed the destruction of an entire family, was over. Yet the pain he caused would last forever. Albert Luna Jr., the man whose theft had sparked the chain of events, remained alive. But he carried the burden that no one should bear. The knowledge that his parents, sister, and little brother had paid the ultimate price for something he had done. First responders, too, remained haunted. Officer Ernie Britz, who had entered the Luna home in the immediate aftermath, recalled the father lying skull-smashed on the floor, the mother and son taped to chairs, and the blood-spattered walls. Decades later, he still shudders at the memory. His partner, John, quit the force shortly afterward, unable to reconcile the horrors he had seen. Others refused interviews for years, the trauma too raw. Richard's death closed the legal chapter, but not the human one. The Luna family would never be whole. the scars on survivors invisible, but unending. The case became a cautionary tale. How obsession, unchecked rage, and the failure of the system to act promptly could combine to create unthinkable tragedy. 32 years after that stolen rifle and cassette player, the consequences were finally absolute. But the lessons lingered. Lives shattered, families destroyed, first responders scarred. The echoes of Richard Djerf's choices would never fade. Richard Djerf's story is a stark reminder of how quickly obsession and rage can spiral out of control. What began as a stolen rifle and a cassette player, a loss replaceable by money or time, became a reason to destroy 4 lives. His inability to let go, his fixation on betrayal and disrespect, turned ordinary frustration into unimaginable violence. The Luna family had nothing to do with the theft, yet they paid the ultimate price. Richard's case shows how unchecked anger can transform the human mind, how personal vendettas can override empathy, morality, and reason. It also highlights the fragility and limitations of justice. Early police inaction, the slow response to a reported burglary, may have been a factor that fanned the flames of his revenge. The system can delay consequences, but it cannot always prevent tragedy when obsession meets opportunity. On the other hand, the legal process, trials, appeals, Supreme Court rulings, demonstrates the complexity of justice, balancing the rights of the accused with the weight of the crimes committed. Ultimately, this story is a meditation on human nature itself. The capacity for cruelty, the danger of fixation, and the high cost when vengeance replaces reason. Richard Djerf lived for decades with the weight of his own actions. Yet the true victims, the Luna family, the survivors, and even first responders, carry scars that never fade. It is a chilling lesson. Obsession and unchecked anger can destroy not only others, but also the soul of the person consumed by it.